Hi, I'm Emily, and I am here with Maya Murphy's attorney, H. Daniel Murphy. Attorney Murphy practices at Maya Murphy's law offices in both New York and Connecticut. My question today for Attorney Murphy is, we have a house that needs to be sold in a divorce. Do we have to wait until the house sells to be divorced? And if not, how would that work?
So with many couples who are going through a divorce, the marital home is the most valuable marital asset that there is. And depending on the rest of the marital estate and the cost of maintaining that home with the parties' respective incomes, it may not make sense for the parties to remain in the house or to be able to keep it after the divorce. Yet if the costs are somehow feasible, the cost of maintaining the house and any equity in the house can be offset with another asset, then one party can effectively buy out the other and be able to keep the house after the divorce. But in the case like you asked about, where the house needs to be sold, there are other problems to contend with that often come up in litigation and post-judgment matrimonial work. To answer the question succinctly, no, you do not have to wait until the house is sold to be divorced. We've seen many instances where one party or the other stays in the former marital home until it's sold, sometimes with minor children, where that is preferable for the children, and sometimes without minor children. In fact, sometimes the date of sale is linked to the children completing a certain level of schooling, middle school or high school. So we'll stay in the house until whatever year, because that's when the children no longer need the benefit of the public school in this particular district. So we have seen and negotiated all different ways in which a house can be kept post-judgment for a period of time, whether it's a few months or whether it's a few years. And depending on the circumstances, the parties can, in some ways, remain partners in the ownership of the house, meaning that the house remains a joint asset and the expenses are shared in some fashion between the parties while it is being lived in. And in those cases, there's a written agreement about when the house will be marketed for sale and how the net proceeds are going to be divided once that actually occurs. So sometimes, not all the time, one party stays in the house and pays all the static expenses related to the home. So the static expenses would be mortgage, taxes, insurance, and in some instances, the other party will receive a credit back of 50% of those static expenses from the proceeds of the home once it is sold. Effectively, in that case, both parties shared the static costs 50-50 until the house is sold, because it was a shared marital investment, marital asset, which is basically being sold at some point later in time and then distributed in accordance with the judgment of divorce. Ordinarily, but not always, a party staying in the marital home, or the former marital home, will pay the utilities and variable costs for the home, since he or she would have been paying those utilities or variable costs if he or she had acquired other housing instead of staying there. If they had moved out of the house, if they had a rental property, or they had another house that they lived in, they would have an electric bill or a cable bill or a water bill. And so it's usually, not always, but the party staying in the house will take on the expenses, the variable expenses related to the house. Other times we have seen in negotiated agreements where the party staying in the house pays a presumptive rent. It's not really a rent payment, but a rental payment for the use of the property. Maybe in some way that rental payment is an amount that's debited from his or her share of the marital home, of the equity and the net proceeds in the house once the marital home is sold. So there's basically a credit back or some sort of recognition of the period of time in which they were able to stay in that home and enjoy the use and occupancy of that joint asset until it is sold. We see two common disagreements in this type of arrangement, things that parties should look out for. One is how and when the house should be sold and for how much. And that's always a difficult question, especially as the market changes. So we can build into the agreement a mechanism for agreeing upon a sales price, although that's not always an ideal circumstance for certain reasons. But one party might have a greater incentive than the other to sell, receive the proceeds and move on. Whereas, for example, maybe the party in the house knows that he or she cannot get a comparable house for the same cost, and therefore has no real incentive to sell it quickly and to move on, but rather would keep things the way they are for as long as possible. Another problem that comes up a lot is how costs are going to be classified, and those variable costs or static costs related to the former marital home. So for example, if there's a major expense that is incurred or has to be incurred, the hot water boiler goes, or the roof leaks, or something catastrophic happens to the house between the time of the date of judgment and the time that the house is sold, how is that cost going to be addressed? And what about a serious maintenance issue as opposed to something that's an issue that's requested to be repaired by a prospective buyer? When the house is being marketed for sale, a prospective buyer wants something to be done, or the real estate agent maybe wants something to be done in order for the house to be sold. So that has to be addressed by and between the parties, preferably at or around the time of judgment, rather than later on when the house is being ready to be sold. And for these reasons, you certainly should consult with an attorney, because the wording of those agreements is very important. And no agreement is really ever going to be perfect in this regard. And that's one of the risks that the parties incur in an arrangement where they hold on to a marital home post-judgment for a period of time. There are other options depending on the time frame we're talking about. Sometimes it might make sense to negotiate an agreement where one party has full responsibility for the house for the date of judgment going forward, and where the other party, the one receiving the money after it's sold, instead of having a percentage share in the net proceeds, actually has a fixed amount of what he or she will receive when it is sold. And that fixed amount would be based on an appraisal at the time of the judgment rather than what the house actually sells for. There's obviously some risk to that as well, depending on the market, but it's also a way to minimize some disagreements during any lengthy period of time that one spouse will not have access or control to what happens with that asset, because they're not living in it, because they're not there all the time, because they're not maintaining it. Remember also, property distribution is enforceable by a court later on, meaning a court can take action or direct a party to follow a judgment in connection with the sale of a former marital home. But property distribution is not modifiable. So in other words, once the terms of that sale and the distribution of that asset are agreed upon and become part of a court order, that's an award of equitable distribution that can't be changed later on. So in any case, actually in every case, you should consult with an attorney about available options and concerns that you may have with the handling of a former marital home in the event of divorce. Speak to someone who's experienced in these types of cases.
Attorney Murphy is available 24/7 and can be reached by calling 203-221-3100. You can also email Attorney Murphy at hdmurphy@mayalaw.com, and please visit mayalaw.com for more information.